His vision for America's place in a new world order.
Returning vets could be a risk to our nation.
We've got to give them a stake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
And one of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance.
I think a new world order is emerging.
This is a hoax and a scam which is designed to transfer wealth and power from the private sector to the government sector and from the government of the United States to a world government.
And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
And who got the money? Hundreds and hundreds of banks. Any bank or that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
Tell us who they are.
No.
You know, financial terrorism. They have the ability to tweak the knob.
I am proposing that the Federal Reserve be granted new authority.
The ultimate goal of the carbon tax and the cap and trade is to destroy production.
This energy tax is the largest tax increase in American history.
We're actually creating a global warming police. So number one, they can come in, the federal government can come in and inspect your house and send you the bill. We're setting up a global warming Gestapo.
One of the things that if you talk to our generals, they are desperate for is a civilian counterpart to our military forces.
I am fierce.
And this is what I wear.
This is not a party issue. This is not a left-right issue. The question is, who should government serve? And it should serve the people.
In fact, government is just a tool of the dominant minority that uses economics and government law to enforce upon the public various mandates.
So in the old days, you used to have this globe that with 180 some odd countries, and a few of those countries had a lot of power, like the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States at various times. But today, you might better look at that globe and say that it's surrounded by huge clouds swirling around the planet. They know no national boundaries. They don't follow any specific sets of laws, and these are the big corporations. They basically control politicians around the world because they have all the money, and politicians always need money to get elected or to run their governments if they're not democratically elected politicians. They control the mainstream press, either through outright ownership or advertising budgets. They have massive amounts of lobbyists in Washington that have tremendous influence on our president and Congress. And they really are calling the shots. They form partnerships with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetans, or with the Israelis and Arab nations, with Brazilians and Indians, with whatever country and whatever group of people has resources that they covet. And so for the first time in history, we really have this new form of an empire.
We don't want to live under a world government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations.
I don't want to believe it, and that's probably what holds me back on it, but I'm certainly seeing enough indication that it could be true. Absolutely, because they're always talking about Mexico and the United States and Canada ending up like Europe. And there's things done politically that seem to take us in that direction. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us as American citizens to pay attention.
This move to world government is not about roses and happiness and peace and in a better life. It's about enslavement.
The rights of free speech, self-defense, private property, due process of law, and many others ignited a revolution in human development that threatened the despotic rule of monarchs and tyrants worldwide. But the corrupt elites had studied history. They knew that great civilizations could only fall from within.
They know from previous experience and history that civilizations come and go and dwindle. They know the reasons why they come and go.
Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Morty Strong, founder of the UN Environment Program, from his opening speech, Rio Earth Summit, 1992.
Maurice Strong is the man who said that they would never allow another country to rise up as powerful as America. It will never be allowed to happen again. And he said the best thing we can do is to tear down all the factories, all the top commerce of the United States, and level it and give it back to nature. So that was the advice from this character, who has tremendous power at the United Nations and was picked up and groomed by Rockefeller himself.
Over the past decades, since the Kennedy assassination approximately, you've had an ongoing oligarchical transformation of virtually every country in the world. And in the United States, it's taken the form of an oligarchical counter-revolution against the reforms of the 1930s, with the Wall Street interest asserting itself as more and more dominant. And once bankers and oligarchs have power, the things that they do, you could call them a policy. You could call it something like a tropism. It's like the way a plant responds. Naturally, since they're oligarchs, they're going to try to downgrade the standard of living of the vast majority of the population. They're going to claim that the world is overpopulated, that industrialization, industrial pollution, and overpopulation are the main problems that face the world. And they're generally going to try to crush and mortify any kind of popular democracy or mass movements with any kind of progressive content.
Nations rise and fall. They knew how debt could never be recuperated. They knew that disease or prolonged war could wipe out the population and the future populations that pay off debt. So these guys all work together. That's why it's no surprise that today you have Lord Rothschild coming out pushing the latest scam or religion that we must all believe in, which is global warming, which his personal bank, his family's bank in Switzerland, will be in charge of. They've run the system, the whole economic system of the world for the last 250 years. So why shouldn't they also run the economic system for the next few hundred years?
The question of a ruling class, oligarchy as a ruling class, is posed by Plato in the Republic, where we find that oligarchy is a constitution full of many evils, where the rich dominate the government by buying it, and the average individual or the poor count for absolutely nothing. Oligarchy is a frame of mind. In other words, if you're a banker, this is already a world view. It's a world outlook, and it implies the policies that have got us here, right? Malthusian policies, zero growth policies, driving down the standard of living, attempts to wipe out all kinds of mass institutions that might be a countervailing force.
This is a scientific dictatorship, which Bertrand Russell said, and the Huxleys said, both Aldous and Julian Huxley said they would bring in the scientifically controlled society. It's not just family planning, which really means abortion and so on. It's global planning, which is literally sterilization and abortion worldwide for the ideal reduced society, and not just across the board, through genetics, through the Genome Project, through the constant IQ testing.
Globalization has economically destroyed the world. You've got at least 40 to 50,000 people who die every day worldwide from starvation, malnutrition, and diseases which can be cured for pennies, such as diarrhea. And if you ask one of these Malthusian oligarchs, don't you think that something should be done to raise the standard of living in Africa or South Asia? They'll say, no, we can't do that. That would wound the planet. That would oppress Mother Earth. So that's oligarchy. Class consciousness in this sense is absolutely essential. If you think that bankers are the same as you, you're wrong. F. Scott Fitzgerald once told Hemingway, you know, the rich are different from us. And Hemingway said, yeah, they have more money. And F. Scott Fitzgerald replied, no, it's something much deeper. It's a whole different world. To be an oligarch, to be a Rockefeller or something of this sort, means that you're in a completely different world with values which are the reverse of human values. Now, if you allow the oligarchs to continue to dominate, the destruction of world civilization is a matter of a few decades at the very, very most. So, choose.
To force their agenda through, the elites are employing one of their favorite tools, artificial crisis creation, also known as the Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
The Earth's ruling elite are first and foremost monopoly men. The founder of the Rockefeller clan summed it up simply when he said, competition is a sin.
Rockefeller himself said that competition was a sin. And people quipped at that, thinking it was one of his little jokes. He made many jokes about saving pennies and stuff like this. But in reality, he was telling you a truth, that competition to a man like him, who worked for a much larger organization, competition truly was a sin. And the cartels have been formed ever since, have become much bigger, more powerful. Cartels which can literally command governments, sometimes to go to war on their behalf, have occurred.
China's holding, what, 1.5 trillion worth all over the world. They're holding U.S. currencies. They want to get out of them in a way where they're not going to lose on their investments. There's going to be a world currency. There's going to be a new reserve currency. They're going to push it through the IMF. That's going to be the banksters that are going to be in charge of it. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
When America finishes supplying the manpower and the military for standardization of the world into the one system, and they want a secular world society with a hint of greening and Gia worship for sustainability reasons, America, as they're finishing off this agenda, they'll be pulling the rug from underneath Americans at home at the same time towards the latter stages. They're now pulling the rug away from under the feet of the people. They're becoming rapidly a non-manufacturing country. Any country that can't manufacture its own goods, even for self-defense, therefore is no longer sovereign, independent, and able to sustain itself, which tells you that this is all part of the plan.
They're going into the greatest depression. There will be no job growth. Unemployment will continue to escalate. Along with it, so too will crime, poverty, kidnappings, boss snappings. And the more things spin out of control, the harder the hammer is going to come down by the federal government to keep everyone in control.
Power is much, much more important to them than money is. Money is only a way to the means. Power is the end result.
The elite's main goal is to destroy national sovereignty and individual independence. To consolidate their grip on power, the banksters create artificial debt bubbles that are mathematically impossible to pay back.
These are those sinister, toxic assets, the complex financial instruments that they talk about but never really name. They're paper based on paper. They're credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, structured investment vehicles, auction rate securities, and so on down the line. It's an immense mass of cancerous, fictitious, speculative paper, bloated in value, impossible to bail out. Triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they try.
The primary driver of the current crisis is accounting control fraud. These are frauds led by the CEOs of the major lending institutions and major banks and institutional buyers of toxic waste product. How did it start? It started with mortgages, particularly non-prime mortgages. In September of 2004, the FBI warned that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, their words, and that this epidemic of mortgage fraud would cause an economic crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle if it wasn't stopped. The FBI found that 80% of the mortgage fraud was being induced by the lenders, not by the borrowers. You know, much of the rage has been against the borrowers, but if you want rage, it should be at the CEOs who became fabulously wealthy by following a strategy based on fraud.
If you try to let the finance oligarchs who created the crisis turn around and say they're the doctors who are going to get you out of the crisis, they will dig you deeper and deeper into the bottomless abyss of world economic depression, financial collapse, and disintegration.
Glass-Steagall said there's an inherent conflict of interest between the commercial banking side, which is the lending side, and the investment banking side, which is taking an ownership position. And we have to end this conflict of interest by separating these two entities. You can have investment banks and you can have commercial banks, but they have to be separate.
This was a pre-registered, pre-organized, predetermined event. Anybody who knows that if you allow the banks to become unregulated financial institutes with tsunami-like weapons of mass destruction like financial instruments like derivatives, to allow that to run up to levels that are 50, 100, 200 times the gross domestic product with no value. They know that they are taking the profits on going up, but they also know that the end result is the destruction and gutting of this economy.
It's a more sophisticated form of slavery, and we're going through it today. We see the taxation is going up all the time with the supposed crash of the banks that was not happening out of the blue. It was set up for this time. They could have kept it going for another few years if it suited them, and then crashed all the bubbles. But now is the time. As they say in their own writings, now is the time.
One of the great benefits of an economic model from an economist standpoint is you can basically get whatever results you want. You can manipulate the inputs to make that happen. And that makes it a very easy tool to use to hoodwink other people.
These manufactured, these engineered financial catastrophes are the result of a central banking system that has the ability to add and subtract credit, add and subtract dollars and money at will to create this roller coaster effect. Because unlike most people, the banks are able to make profits as easily on the way down as they can on the way up in any given situation. Volatility is great for banks and professionals. Volatility is not great for the most average people.
What's being used is what I call, to try to get the money, is what I call the suicide threat, where, you know, if anybody has ever seen the movie Blazing Saddle, the sheriff is surrounded by hostile town folks. He takes out his gun, points it at his head and says, you know, don't move or I'll shoot. Well, that's what the big banks are saying. You know, give us unlimited cash or we'll die. And if we die, you'll die because we're too big to fail.
We have, you know, people in the government threatening martial law or things to get their way in the executive branch against Congress. You know, you know, if you put all these signs together, it doesn't look good at all. That, to the extent we are a democracy, we're sort of a hairbreadth away from a police state.
You cannot print phantom money out of thin air, backed by nothing, and producing practically nothing without destroying the world economy.
So unless we cut out the toxic funds, the toxic elements of this economy, every time we put in money on this bailout, it's just feeding the fire. It's not making things better.
What should have happened is that those banks and investment banks should have been seized. They should have been seized by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Those are zombie banks. The Chase Manhattan, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Wachovia, so on down the line, to AIG in the insurance realm. These are zombie institutions, insolvent, bankrupt. The only thing to do with them is to seize them, put them through Chapter 11 bankruptcy. That'll probably turn into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, liquidation. And above all, triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they tried.
They will, of course, try to regain some of this money back, but the debts, unlike any other period in history, are now a quantum size bigger than the entire global GDP by a factor of 50 to 100. It's almost infinite amount of debt.
If you really look at the numbers, because of the massive, massive debt, and right now, total debt in this country is about 375% of the gross domestic product. And that's not including derivatives. If you put the derivatives in, it's probably 20 to 30 times gross domestic product. It's beyond what anybody has ever even considered.
Foreign banks, Société Générale of France, about 10 billion for a French bank. Deutsche Bank of Germany.
Did Deutsche Bank need the money? How much did they get from the bailout? Well, they told us they got 12 billion from the bailout.
And Barclays Bank of Britain, 10 billion. So you're up to almost $50 billion to bail out a series of foreign banks that were derivatives counterparties of AIG, plus Goldman Sachs.
This is the biggest swindle, not only in the history of the United States, this is the biggest swindle in transfer of wealth in the history of the Western countries.
Since the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913, patriots have labored tirelessly to alert the American people to the true nature of the Federal Reserve. Throughout its 90-plus year history, most Americans falsely believed that the Federal Reserve was a government agency. But today, scientific opinion polls show that the vast majority of the public is aware of the fact that the Federal Reserve is a front company for an offshore private banking cartel that dominates not just the United States, but almost every other nation on earth.
It's never been written about in any book that I've found as to who gave these guys the authority or permission to be the international bankers for the world. Why would you even need international bankers? Why would any government agree to use them? Why would you need to use them? Why can't any country create its own money? It tells you there was already an existing superstructure, already in existence, maybe 200-300 years ago, to give these guys permission to somehow be the overlords of all money for all countries. Every country goes into action at the same time. The International Monetary Fund is mentioned at the G20 meeting. They say that it must be brought to its full power, and we need a Bretton Woods Part 2 for world taxation.
What is global government? For decades, the media denied it existed. But now they're saying, oh yes, there's going to be a global government, a new bank of the world, and we're going to pay our carbon taxes to it. What is it? It's nothing more than a private, hostile, corporate takeover of every sovereign nation on earth. And then when you look at the philosophy of these global corporate chieftains, it is one of domination of the poor, domination of the population. It is a view that human life just isn't cheap. No, human life is a negative. And so no matter what they do, they have the rationale that it's in the greater interest to get rid of more human lives.
They are so arrogant and they're so sure of themselves, they're saying, yes, we created the European Union, we created the Euro, and these are from the people of the Bilderberg. We are going to create a world bank. We're going to create a world government. They're saying it out loud and clearly.
Where are the American people? Why have they lost their dignity? What is stopping them from speaking out? Why have they become little mice that follow Pied Pipers? How can they look up to these pathetic politicians?
Go sit down. I have a question for this young man. He has the right to be represented. I'm his father, and I want to talk to you face to face.
And shut the door. I'm not a lobbyist with all kind of money to stuff in your pocket so that you can cheat the citizens of this country. So I'll leave, and you can do whatever the hell you please to do.
So we have more surveillance. Now they're talking about, what is it called, Cybercom, the new Pentagon secret cyber society that's going to be watching over us to get those terrorists. We got to get those terrorists. So now they'll be invading our privacy even more.
So, I mean, it really almost makes you ask the question, would it have been better if we never invented the internet?
They just want to keep tabs on us. So we're turning into a surveillance, wiretapped government state. The government is taking more and more control over our lives.
We're programmed today perfectly, just like machines. We tie this in with the Brzezinski. Brzezinski said in 2 Ages. Now this guy was way up with the NSA. He's a master geopolitician. He admits he works in 20, 50-year periods to do with geopolitics in other countries. But he said himself, the public will shortly be unable to think or reason for themselves. It was meaning by the form of information that was given to them, the type, the formulas that were in use then in the 1970s. He says, eventually they'll be unable to think or reason for themselves. And eventually, he said, they will expect the media to do all their thinking and reasoning for them. Well, that's happened today. That's why people today can't think outside of the programming from television. We're gullible, but we're also willingly gullible. We want a human being, a big daddy, to come along and make everything right for us. And as long as we believe that, we'll always basically get shafted.
Many of the strategies used to control populations were originally developed by Edward Bernays, who coined the phrase public relations. Bernays said that if you manufacture an authoritative figure who repeats the same messages over and over, that this will appeal to the masses' subconscious desires.
Yes, we can.
The unwashed masses will helplessly follow the leader and go along with any message they spout.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We shall overcome. Yes, we can. We will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Under the Nazis, there was something called race science. They had a lunatic theory of eugenics, the Aryan heritage, and all the rest of this. Absolute crackpot pseudoscience. There was no empirical measure or empirical test for the validity of those theories. They simply asserted them, and if you were a professor who stood up to them, then the Gestapo would come and take you away.
They use the environmental movement to promote their real agenda, which is globalization and federalization and power.
The advisor to Gordon Brown wants to exterminate 1/2 of the population of the British Isles. Now that's something Hitler might have tried to do, or Stalin. They didn't succeed. Will Gordon Brown do it? You can read this in the statements of these lunatics. Radical environmentalists, fanatical Malthusians, tree huggers, whatever you want to call them. This is an ideology of genocide which can be documented exhaustively, ad nauseum, out of their own statements.
It is time to stand up and say, we get to choose. We choose liberty or we choose tyranny. It's one of the two. The underlying bill represents the tyranny and the intervention of the federal government. It's our choice. What will we choose today? Will we choose liberty or will we choose tyranny?
A select group of central banks are lobbying for the same legislation to be passed worldwide. Once the so-called green economy laws are in place, only global megacorporations and their subsidiaries will be allowed to do business. Van Jones, Barack Obama's first green job czar, has stated repeatedly on the record that the new green economy is only a cover for a complete revolution against capitalism and the total redistribution of wealth. But what Van Jones doesn't tell his sad followers is that the elite are bragging that the modern green movement was designed from its creation to destroy the middle class and transfer all wealth into the hands of a super elite. They're not doing this to uplift the poor. No, the goal is to enslave the planet and usher in a new dark age. Every nation on Earth is in the process of, or has already passed, its own set of carbon tax laws and regulations. If their plan is successful, every nation on Earth will not only pay tribute to the powerful world government, but every facet of human life will be regulated by the technocratic global planners. Under the carbon tax scheme, China, India, Mexico, and over 150 other nations are exempt from the global tax system. You see, the bankers already own and control the third world. Their final target is the middle class of the West. Once they've dismantled the economies of the United States, Europe, and Japan, they believe no one can stand in their way. In short, the New World Order is a global corporate takeover. In their global corporate state, there is no room for individuality, sovereignty, or independence. If the people are able to block their carbon tax takeover, the elite's agenda to establish a planetary world government will collapse. To force their unpopular agenda upon the planet, the controllers are racing to complete the construction of their police state control grid. Borrowing from tactics used in the past by communist, fascist, and other totalitarian regimes, every form of classical textbook tyranny is now being implemented in the West. In the United States, the central government is federalizing local police.
State and local officers are in a great position to collect important information on terrorists and their allies, and the Terrorist Screening Center stands ready to help you.
This video, produced by Homeland Security, is required viewing for all departments in the U.S.
And with the teamwork of local, state, and federal law enforcement, we have an excellent opportunity to see the picture and solve the puzzle before these terrorists can strike again.
State, county, and city police now take their marching orders directly from DHS and FEMA. The videos and training manuals turn peace officers, once guardians of the Republic, into secret police.
See way down there? There's a woman taking photos of the dam. Someone called 911 and reported a suspicious person. As you guessed, she's going to be a Category 3 hit. And since it's very important that we don't let her know that we know, both the dispatcher and the officer need to make sure she doesn't hear the radio traffic.
Stand by. I could ask you to wait right here, please.
Sure.
Everyday items and activities are listed as proof that you are sympathizing with shadowy boogeymen of terror.
Of course, he's going to keep his eyes open for anything interesting or unusual in the car. That would include cameras, binoculars, video equipment, GPS, maybe things like sleeping bags that suggest they're living out of the car.
From their inception, Homeland Security and Northcom were set up to dominate the people and the states, not to fight the CIA-created Al-Qaeda. Patriotic members of the military and law enforcement, at great risk to their lives and careers, have sent this filmmaker federally and internationally produced law enforcement manuals, textbooks, documents, and videos. In the old Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Maoist China, the police's main job was not fighting crime. In totalitarian forms of government, the police are political enforcers, or commissars as they were known in Russia. It's their job to spy on the public and to intimidate the exercise of free speech. Once a climate of fear has been achieved, the public begins to self-censor, to shut down. Once the people have been intimidated to withdraw from the field of intellectual battle, the tyrants have a free hand to expand their oppression and looting of the helpless serfs. The average man and woman is in a trance. But the scientific dictatorship needs more than just a secret police network to carry out their plan. Citizen spies at every level of society have been recruited to keep their eyes and ears focused on everything their neighbors and co-workers are doing and saying. More than 50,000 private sector executives have been recruited by FEMA to secretly serve as deputy FBI informants under the InfraGard program. Now there are more than 75,000 preachers serving FEMA in the clergy response teams. Internal FEMA documents reveal that the majority of America's pastors now serve as agents of the shadow government. They are even instructed on how and what to preach.
MSKSLA News 12 Jeff Farrell discovered the clergy would help the government with potentially their biggest problem, us.
From my cold, dead hands.
Charlton Heston's famous declaration captures a truly American value, the overarching desire to protect our freedoms. But gun confiscation is exactly what happened during the state of emergency following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. U.S. troops also arrived, something far easier to do even now thanks to last year's elimination of the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. That forbid U.S. troops from policing on American soil. If martial law were enacted here at home, public fears and quelling dissent would be critical. And that's exactly what the Clergy Response Team, as it's called, helped accomplish in New Orleans.
Jeff, the primary thing that we say to anybody is let's cooperate and get this thing over with, and then we'll settle the differences once the crisis is over.
Such clergy response teams would walk a tightrope between the needs of the government versus the wishes of the public.
In a lot of cases, these clergy would already be known in the neighborhoods in which they're helping to defuse that situation.
For the clergy, one of the biggest tools that they will have in helping calm the public down or obey the law is the Bible itself, specifically Romans 13.
Because the government is established by the Lord, and that's what we believe in the Christian faith. That's what's stated in the Scripture.
They prepare their flocks like sheep to the slaughter for gun confiscation, forced inoculation, and they tell them that it is a blessing to have their families broken up and put into FEMA camps.
Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Polen, Ungarn, Romania.
Adolf Hitler bragged that his most powerful domestic tool, used by the Nazis to control the people, was the servile clergy. And his favorite Bible verse was Romans 13, render unto Caesar.
The Department of Homeland Security calling on firefighters to take on a new role in the war on terror. The idea to be the eyes for the U.S. government when they're inside a home. Now, unlike police officers, firefighters don't need a warrant to go into private houses. And critics say that's where things get sticky.
Cable company repairmen, truck drivers, maid services, and hundreds of other professions that go inside homes and businesses without warrants are now on the government's payroll as citizen snitch spies. But Big Brother doesn't stop there. Children are being indoctrinated inside the public schools nationwide to spy on their parents.
You can give information without having to give your name. You guys can get paid for good tips up to $200.
The New York Times praised public school programs in the United States and England that are training children to report their parents for eco-crimes, like taking a hot bath or letting the water run while you brush your teeth. All of that violates their carbon footprint credit allotment.
Check it out, check it out. And that's where we come in. We're the carbon cops and we're on the lookout for energy wasters.
Our job is to get all Australian households to cut their carbon emissions. So Carbon Cops is a program that looked at energy use in a domestic sense. We went into people's houses and got them to reduce their energy use by 50%.
Sadly, the Boy Scouts of America have now contracted with the Department of Homeland Security and are now training more than 20,000 Boy Scouts in anti-terror urban warfare mount training. The federal grants are very specific. The Scouts are trained to carry out seek and destroy missions against disgruntled veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces.
Good evening, everyone. Homeland Security is enlisting some unlikely new recruits to fight terrorism and help with other emergencies. The Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts across the country and here in East Tennessee are now taking part.
9-year-old Elise Murphy has already earned a lot of Girl Scout patches.
And now, every member of the 3.4 million Girl Scouts of America is now being trained by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to aid and support Homeland Security in disaster and anti-terror operations.
Everybody somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25 will serve 3 months of basic training and understanding in a kind of civil defense.
So is this compulsory then?
Well, you have to, in a sense, it's a required of everybody, 18 to 25, 3 months. And at some point at that point, you do it.
Creating citizen armies in one way is, it's disgusting. Because what you do is you get young kids and you can mold their minds easily. And we saw them chanting and crying, and they'll follow any leader, whether it's in a black shirt, a brown shirt, a red shirt, whatever the shirt might be.
Another branch of Homeland Security, the Corporation for National and Community Service, is setting up literally hundreds of other private uniformed youth groups. The White House has introduced legislation to establish forced national service for all Americans between the ages of 16 and 64. In 2008, the North American Military Governorship, known as NORTHCOM, announced that they had deployed 4,000 regular Army troops inside the United States to deal with civil unrest because they knew that their offshore masters were about to rob the United States blind. In 2009, the Pentagon requested funding from Congress to deploy 379,000 military personnel in thousands of communities across the United States. And now, legislation has been introduced in Congress to expand a system of FEMA concentration camps across the United States under the National Emergency Centers Act, H.R. 645. The Republic is hanging by a thread. The last vestiges of our free system of government are being swept away.
You know, you got time to watch baseball, you got time to watch football, you got time to entertain yourself, but I think a knowledgeable public we're losing, and we've got to get people back on track to paying attention, because if you don't pay attention to your government and what they're doing, you're going to pay some dire consequences for it.
Unless we become active and become influential in the power centers of society, there's nothing we can do about it. Just knowing about it is not enough. And as long as we are given at election time an option between the Republican candidate or the Democrat candidate, both of whom have been selected by members of the Council on Foreign Relations and both of whom have the same general policies, that's not going to change anything either. So the real issue is, so what? And the answer is we've got to recapture control of the power centers of society.
The people have a decision to make. Our nation has been seized in the jaws of a global corporate takeover. The Republic is passing into history. We're losing our freedoms. And it's up to every man, woman, and child in the United States to decide whether we're going to be fooled by the slick propaganda of the social engineers or whether we're going to restore the Republic.
Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country, because the country is being stolen from us in broad daylight. Not only stolen metaphorically, but financially as well. The numbers don't lie.
The American people, having been educated as to the truth, then have to rise up and demand and get a government that starts serving them. We need a change, and it isn't going to come from Democrats and Republicans. It has to come from the American people.
Dissension is the greatest form of patriotism, and I believe that. Because if you don't hold your elected officials' feet to the fire and pay attention, you are going to get bad government. So it's imperative for all of us. It's our job as citizens of this great country to pay attention.
This is our last chance to not relive history. Hundreds of nations have fallen to tyranny in the last century alone. America is a prize coveted by the despotic megacorporations that now dominate our planet. If their world government is truly to rise, freedom and the republic for which it stands must fall. Now is the time for all good men and women to come to the aid of their country. One of the greatest events in history is taking place before our very eyes. For many generations into the future, our progeny will look back on this time as either a place where humanity rose to the challenge and made a stand against the forces of darkness, or as a time when the planet fell into the grip of a merciless high-tech tyranny. In Part 2 of Fall of the Republic, you will learn the elite's master plan for humanity. But more importantly, you will learn how to stop that plan, reverse the criminal tide, and reignite the flame of liberty on the long march to man's ultimate destiny.